Okay, so what does it mean back to the beginning? Well, we started the year in a series called The Beginning and the End, or really it was more of the beginning because we had a week where we canceled church and then we spent a little bit in Revelation. So it was mainly about the beginning. And what we were finding out is as we were progressing through this text, there were some big theological ideas that people have, well, they've come up with the right answer. And they roll with that as the right answer in these big theological ideas, and foundations and doctrines are built on some of these big ideas. And so we want to, once again, as we wrestled with the creation story, possibly two creation stories, as we wrestled through that, we're going to wrestle through these four ideas of stewardship, of Sabbath next week, of suitable, which really means a suitable helper, and then finally sin, which we'll do in the fourth week. And really try to figure out or understand, are there possibilities here in what our writer might be saying or what God might be saying, or have those who've arrived at the right answer, are they right? And that's really our challenge in reading of Scripture, isn't it? We're trained as Greek thinkers, and Greek thinkers want right answers. And so Christians want right answers out of the Bible. We want to read it and get the right answer. Where Hebrew readers want to wrestle with it, want to struggle with it, want to suggest even that maybe there's a different meaning for a different generation, right? Just a wrestling match with God. And so I think I stand more in that camp, to wrestle with the Word of God and to see how God can mold me and make me as we wrestle through what He has for us. And so we're going to continually process that. So I want to start this morning with this timeline. We talked about it, but I never made it visual. And I want us to think about this a little bit because it matters. So creation, though some people have dated creation, I'm not dating creation, occurred out there somewhere. Abraham, we all know the story of Abraham, most of us. It occurs in about 2000 BC. The Exodus dated around 1270 BC, though there is a camp that says the Exodus was in 1440 BC, right? So already we have tension, but I like the 1270 date. David around 1076 BC, the first exile to the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the exile to the Babylonians in 586 BC. Okay, so that's some basic history. Now, the traditional view, which is marked by the arrow, the traditional view, is that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's the traditional view. You could hold that view. That's okay, but the point will come out here in a minute. Modern scholarship says that Genesis 2 was written probably between 800 and 1000, which really becomes a time of prosperity. Right? So Genesis 2 and 3 written possibly during a time of prosperity. And then we talked about this a little. Modern scholarship would say Genesis 1 was added during this time of exile, like between the 500 and 700 time period. Very different time in the history of Israel. Now, what we have to remember is this is an oral culture, as Betsy pointed out to us again last week, an oral culture that finally begins to write down these oral stories. And the way oral cultures work is through story, right? Is they tell stories. And so at some point, whether it's Moses, whether it's later on, God moves in people to write down these oral stories. And none of us were there when they wrote them down. Yet what do historians and scholars do when they're trying to figure out history? Is they ask questions of history, right? They find ancient documents, they find ancient writings, they find all these things, they ask questions of these documents to formulate, guesses. Best guesses. And sometimes they're like, this is, 99% this was it, or I'm living in the 50% range, but guesses, right? They're guessing because no one was there. They're reading and understanding and asking questions of what they have to encounter. Does that make sense? And so, whether you believe Moses wrote it, whether you believe a priestly writer wrote Genesis 1, another guy wrote Genesis 2, and took these from oral stories that have been building and building and building, you have to understand, right, that as historians and scholars begin to look at this, they begin to ask questions of all of this to discern an answer. Now, as Greek thinkers, we want the answer, right? We're like, there's an answer. There's one right answer. Let's come up with the right answer. So we struggle when there might be multiple. And my suggestion, as we've been teaching through the last few years, is it's in the struggle, it's in the wrestling match where we really get to know God. If I've got all the answers, I don't need to pursue God. But when I'm wrestling through the answers, I'm wrestling through what God has said, what God is doing, what God has done, man, I got to keep at it, I got to keep at it, and I got to keep at it. I want to give you a practical example from what occurred last Sunday and then through this week on how one doesn't know what, even from an oral story, one doesn't know unless one, like a historian or a scholar, asks questions. Okay? So last week, if you recall, I was walking the aisle and I was giving an announcement about the church workday. And I said I was going to be snarky. And at the end of that snarkiness, I said, if you don't show up, maybe you don't care. Some of you may have taken that literally and said, Tim is so harsh. Some of you might have said, well, he said he was going to be snarky, so maybe this is exaggeration and he's trying to make a point. Some of you sat there and said, well, I saw the sign in his office that says sarcasm is one of my gifts. And so he was just being sarcastic. Some of you are like, I don't listen to him anyway, so I wasn't listening. And then, so we have that, right? We have that going on. But then, what you don't know is maybe Tim woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day. Maybe he was just in a bad mood that day. Maybe he's had a bad week. Right? You get it, right? And if you formulated a conclusion without asking questions, it's your conclusion. Right? It's your conclusion without asking the questions. Now, the questions you could have asked without talking to me is, does Tim really talk like that? Has he ever really gotten up there and threatened us? Is he normally sarcastic? Does he right? Those are questions you could have asked about the past, but you don't know in that moment unless you asked me the questions. So do you understand how the struggle with trying to say we have the right answers when we're looking at ancient texts and ancient stories? And so we want to walk through these with that understanding over the next 4 weeks, that we're going to wrestle together. We might even disagree together, but what we're going to agree together is that we're going to pursue God together in it. We're going to pursue God together, maybe wrestle with each other a little bit, wrestle with God a little bit more. You get it, right? That's the idea. Because when I just arrive, then I don't need to wrestle, and we want to do that. So let's take a look at our text. You can turn to Genesis 1. We're going to look at 3 verses in Genesis 1, and then we're going to look at 1 verse in Genesis 2. Starting in verse 28 is where we will be. The NIV Bible in the pew, I'll be reading from the ESV. Okay. And so God's just created, in Genesis 1, God's just created man and woman in his image. Okay. And he blessed them. And now he speaks to them. Okay, so he speaks to man and woman, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so we get this idea of this first thing God is telling these 2 brand new humans is make more humans. Okay? He said, the idea here is I've created 2. Now, you have a responsibility to make more, and your job in making more is to fill the earth. And then he says, subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And these are difficult words. Subdue, dominion, right? The translation kind of comes out rule over the animals, right? Rule over this thing. And in the Hebrew, they're tough words. They're tough words to translate. And man, if you look down at all the different meanings they can have, they're just tough. And you're trying to think, well, if this were Moses, what was he thinking? If this were one of our writers, a priestly writer who's lived through a whole bunch and is living in exile, what's the meaning here? And so we get this idea from these words, you have responsibility over the animals. And then God said, behold, and I want you to look at this closely, and I want you to think about, this is the initial creation in Genesis 1 being recorded, okay? And whoever wrote it, this is what God is saying to these first two humans. I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. So, as we already know, that God created plants and trees that produce seed, so they reproduce themselves. And God's saying, look, I've given you them for food. Verse 30. And every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, which we talked about before, which was very significant, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. Well, this is really interesting. This is really interesting, right? There's a lot of ways one could read this. And this is, by the way, this is a writer, whoever it is, who's already quite familiar with the sacrificial system and eating of animals. Okay, so our writer, whether it's Moses or someone later, he is quite familiar with the sacrificial system God put in place, its meaning and all of those things. But as they're writing down this initial story, what they record is God says, humans, I've given you all the fruit and plants you need to eat, and animals, I've given them every green plant for food, with no mention of killing or slaughtering animals. Interesting, isn't it? So I don't know what you conclude by that, but as I read others, what I conclude is don't kill. That as God creates for the first time, as God creates paradise with humans and animals and fish and creepy things, and he's saying, I've given you the nature to eat, man and animal alike at creation. Maybe God's saying, in the perfect world of things, there's no killing. I don't know. He doesn't say don't eat meat, and our writers already know they eat meat, and the ceremony behind the sacrifice and all of those things, they all know that as they're writing it, and as they're telling these stories century after century after century. But this idea that when God created, there was this amazing peacefulness of man and animal existing together. Oof, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Jump to chapter 2, verse 15. Is this Moses, or is this another writer who's writing during a time of prosperity? So, verse 15 says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden. So that means that God created the man somewhere over here, and then God takes the man over to this garden he's created, and he puts the man in said garden. And he tells him two things about this garden. Two things he's supposed to do with this garden. He says, work it and keep it. Or guard it is a good word there as well. Work the garden and protect. Guard the garden. Take care of the garden. Now, what I want you to notice here is a couple things. Is one, from the very beginning, man, woman, humankind was designed to work. Work became labor after this event we're going to look at in chapter 3 in 3 more weeks. But prior to that, when God created man and woman, they had something to do. They just weren't to sit under the tree and eat papayas. They were to work the creation and take care of the garden. Whatever that would mean, whatever that might look like. Work, guard, and take care of it. Okay, now what we've done, because we like to come up with descriptions and words, and because we want the answer, is we've come up with a word with which we call this, right? And what we call this word we call this, for the most part, is stewardship. Taking care of something, overseeing it because God said, you have dominion over the fish and all that, and eat that, and then work it and keep it, guard it, right? We look at that and we give it this word. But man, I've always wrestled with this word as the only word. And then when we met this week, we're like, well, we don't like this word because it doesn't necessarily encompass all that God is saying here. And when we have just one word, right, because now if I like this word, I can go live in the land of dominion and subdue, and I can rule. And I can live in a camp where I'm the manager of it, and I'm going to rule over it, and it's on me. And I can do what I want with it without thinking of anybody else. So we started to throw out other words. And so I'm going to throw out some other words to you this morning that I believe fall in this as well. And then at the last one, I'm going to put some question marks because you may be jotting down some words you think this text is saying as well. Because I think there's a bigger picture of what God is saying than just stewardship. And we're going to define these words here in a minute. But another word we came up with was caretaker. And maybe it's not just about managing it all. Maybe there's this aspect of caring for it. Then we came up with this word member or membership. This idea that we're all in it together. This idea that it's a partnership possibly. That it's not just one or two who manage and everybody else participates, right? That maybe we're all in it together. And then we throw out this word creator. If I am created and you're created in the image of God who is a creator, has God given us creative abilities to use within this creation? And then finally, throw your own word up there. Write another word down. Think through this a little bit. Right? And that's what wrestling does and discussion does. If I'm like, it's all about stewardship, let's move along to the next thing, I don't need to talk about it, I've finalized it. But if I've got to look and say, is it really just that? Is God saying other things? So what do these words talk about, right? Let's look at it. So stewardship is really about managing something. So I can't just live there because God isn't saying just manage creation. He's saying preserve it, right? That's a caretaker. A caretaker preserves. There's responsibility. There's accountability in managing. There's responsibility in preserving. And then participating says we all have a role, right? That's where the member comes. And then finally the creator says, well, maybe there's some origination. Well, I don't know. If I've got to create more humans, there's some origination there. And in other areas, right? And so maybe God is saying, look, this whole thing isn't just about one idea. Yeah, you've got to manage at times. You've got to preserve at times. You've got to definitely participate at times. And sometimes I'm going to call you to originate things. And if I just live in one of those camps, then I can truly say this is what it means and arrive at the right answer. But if I'm looking at it as I have multiple responsibilities in this thing God has placed me in, maybe I look at it a little bit differently. Manage, preserve, participate, originate. So what is it? What are the opposites? Anybody got words for the opposites of these? Neglect, exploit, abandon. Any others you can think of? Apathy, consume, observe, sit on the sideline like abandon, abstain. Right? These become the opposites of these things. And that's not what's in the text, is it? God doesn't say, hey, exploit it all. Use it up in the first generation. Who cares about the next? God doesn't say, you know what, just decimate the entire population of a certain plant or a certain animal for however you want, just for your well-being. God's like, work it and keep it. Manage it, preserve it, participate in it. Create. Man, we have a responsibility, don't we? We have a responsibility. Whether you think it's only a one-word description God's talking about, or God's already been throwing out multiple words, right? This is a bigger thing. We are made, which blows me away every time I'm going to say these words, in the image of God. No thanks. That's a lot right there. Right? We've been made in the image of God. Whether you proclaim Jesus or you don't proclaim Jesus, you have been made in the image of God. And being made in the image of God, God didn't say, hey, I'm going to come down and, I'm going to hang out down there with you in this form of He sent Jesus for that for a little bit, right? But it is the Spirit of God. And God's saying it is your humankind responsibility. What does that look like? That's really where these devotional questions are going to challenge you, right? Some of you are like, man, give me historical questions. I want to jump in. No. I'm going to give us self-reflective internal questions. How are you managing what God's given you? How are you preserving what God has blessed you with? How are you participating in whatever God has asked you to participate in? How are you being a creator? Right? How are we as individuals, and even thinking as a church, how are we being who God wants us to be on planet Earth in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 2026? Is this who we are? And when people look at us, or when people write a story about us, or tell a story about us, are they going to say, these people exploited everything they touched? And they abused it. They didn't care about it. They used it for their own well-being. Weren't thinking about anybody else. Or are they going to say, oh my gosh, I've never seen a group of people who were so tightly knit in it together to preserve and manage and create what God had blessed them with? I don't know. That's how I want to be known. So wrestle with these words. Read them over and over and over this week. Right, it's so easy on a Sunday morning. We come in, we're like, hey, that was good. We like it. We give thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. Okay, God moved a little bit. I'm done for the week. No. It's the idea of thinking about it all week with questions and rereading it and to say, okay, God, what are you saying to Tim Evans? What are you saying to me about what you have for me in this creation that you've given us, moving creation forward? There's a quote I came across. I think it's what I have next. I really don't know. John Muir, you know this guy? He was an environmentalist, wilderness guy, right? A lot of stuff named for him. I don't have any idea of his spirituality, but I came across this quote, and I'm like, oh man, it's kind of deep, but it really, I wrestle with it a little bit. When one tugs at a single thing in nature, one finds it attached to the rest of the world. When you mess with another human, you mess with the world. When you mess with another plant or a tree or, I don't know, squash the ant, it's all attached. We're all in this together, this creation thing that we try to figure out and try to follow God in and figure out what his role for us is as individuals, as corporately. I feel like as I was wrestling through that this week, like, yeah, oh my gosh, that gives me a bigger view of the world, doesn't it? If I'm not thinking this big view, I'm just thinking little Tim just consuming all he wants, having all he wants, doing all he wants. And not recognizing what little Tim does actually does affect everybody around me. So I'm starting to answer maybe the question you thought this morning. It's going to be like this for the next 3 weeks as we wrestle through what God is saying, what God isn't saying, and how we might have heard it in the past am I willing to look at it from other angles and other perspectives? And then, even if I don't like what the guy in the pulpit says, am I willing to wrestle with God about it? That's really where it matters. Who cares what the guy in the pulpit says? What matters is, am I really ready to get after it with God and see what God does with me